At exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, while a string quartet in the back of a stone chapel outside Dayton, Ohio, was still finishing the last bars of a wedding march, a woman named Naomi Pruitt felt her phone buzz once against her thigh through 3 layers of silk, and by the time she read the message standing in the vestibule with her bouquet still trembling in her hand, the man who sent it had no idea he'd just detonated the biggest professional mistake of his life. The text was 4 words long. Effective immediately. You're done. No signature was needed. Only one man at Ironbridge Architectural Group had both the authority and the pettiness to fire his top project manager during her own wedding reception. And Naomi knew his name before she even opened the thread. She turned to show her new husband, Silas Bennett, expecting outrage to match her own. Instead, he studied the screen for a long moment, and something unreadable crossed his face. Not shock, not comfort, but the quiet look of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. "Not today," he said softly, folding her hand back around the bouquet. "Today is ours. Tomorrow, we take it apart." Before this story goes further, if you're the kind of person who believes quiet people are sometimes the most dangerous people in the room, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time the reception reached its 3rd hour, Naomi Pruitt's phone had stopped buzzing politely and started ringing without pause. Her maid of honor, Nadia Okafor, pulled her aside during the first dance with wide eyes and a hand pressed flat over her sternum. "You have over 100 missed calls," Nadia whispered. "One of them is from Douglas Ashford himself, the founder, calling you on your wedding day." Naomi glanced at the screen, glowing faintly beneath the table linens. 17 calls from Douglas, dozens from the office line, a handful from numbers she didn't recognize at all. Whatever Colton Ashford had done by firing her over text, it clearly hadn't been cleared with his father, and it clearly hadn't gone the way he'd expected. 3 questions settled into Naomi's chest as she watched her husband move calmly through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing at toasts, betraying nothing. Why did Colton choose today, of all days, to finally push her out? What did Silas already know that made him so unbothered by a firing that should have devastated her? And what, exactly, was waiting inside that mountain of missed calls that a man like Douglas Ashford would break etiquette to reach her before the cake was even cut? Naomi Pruitt had never been the kind of person who did anything halfway. Her mother used to joke that she alphabetized her spice rack before she could tie her shoes, and by the time she reached architecture school at the University of Cincinnati, that same precision had turned into something closer to a gift. She graduated with honors in project management, a minor in structural systems tucked in behind it, and a reputation for catching errors that senior engineers had walked past twice. She joined Ironbridge Architectural Group 8 years ago, back when Douglas Ashford still walked the floor personally, checking in on every major submission with the kind of hands-on attention that had built the firm's reputation across 3 counties. Douglas recognized something in Naomi almost immediately. Not just competence, but a rare instinct for systems, for the invisible architecture behind the architecture. He handed her a mess of paper files, outdated spreadsheets, and half-documented permit histories, and asked her to fix it. What she built over the following 2 years became the backbone of the entire company. A proprietary tracking system that logged every blueprint revision, every engineering sign-off, every client change order, cross-referenced against every permit filed with the city. Project turnaround times dropped by nearly a third. Client retention climbed. Douglas called her, more than once, in front of senior staff, the best hire he'd ever made. Then, 14 months ago, Douglas suffered a mild stroke, and in the recovery period that followed, he made the decision that would eventually unravel almost everything he'd spent 3 decades building. He handed daily operations to his only son. Colton Ashford had spent most of his adult life failing upward through his father's company, a stint in acquisitions that ended in a lawsuit quietly settled, a marketing initiative that burned through budget with nothing to show for it, and now, at 31, a directorship he'd been handed rather than earned. Where Douglas had leaned on Naomi's systems and praised her openly, Colton excluded her from meetings, took credit for her documentation in front of clients, and grew visibly irritated whenever anyone reminded him that the firm's smoothest running department existed almost entirely inside one woman's head. Naomi watched the shift happen in small increments at first. A meeting moved to a time she wasn't told about. A client call rescheduled without her calendar being checked. A hallway conversation that stopped abruptly when she walked past. She told herself, for a while, that Colton simply had a different management style than his father, that the adjustment period would smooth itself out once he settled into the role. It didn't. Within 2 months, he had quietly reassigned 3 of her direct reports to other departments, leaving her to manage a workload built for a team of 4, almost entirely alone. And when she raised the imbalance in a formal meeting, Colton told her, in front of 2 junior associates, that she should be flattered anyone still trusted her with that much responsibility at all. It was during this tense stretch, while Colton was quietly restructuring departments and Naomi was quietly bracing for the worst, that she met Silas Bennett. He worked behind the permits counter at the City of Dayton Buildings Department, one of the few reviewers who actually read submissions line by line instead of stamping them through. They met over a disputed structural filing for Ironbridge's biggest project in a decade, the Miller's Landing Riverfront Revitalization, a multi-phase development worth north of $11 million. What started as professional correspondence turned into coffee, then dinner, then a proposal on a bridge overlooking the very river the project was meant to transform. Naomi never told Silas how precarious her position at Ironbridge had become. She didn't need to. 2 months before the wedding, Colton began making comments in meetings about streamlining redundant roles, always looking somewhere over her shoulder when he said it. She planned her small chapel wedding partly because she and Silas were practical people, and partly because some quiet, unspoken part of her suspected she wouldn't have a job to return from a longer honeymoon to. She never imagined Colton would actually go through with it on the day itself, and in the church vestibule, Holding a phone that had just ended her employment in 4 words, she felt something colder than grief settle into her chest. The sense that everything she'd built at Ironbridge might now be leverage instead of loss. The reception blurred into something Naomi would only half remember later. Toasts, a cake she barely tasted, her father's hand shaking slightly as he pulled her into a dance. Underneath all of it, her phone kept buzzing in Nadia's clutch purse like something alive. When she finally slipped away to the bridal suite near the end of the night, she sat on the edge of a velvet chaise in her wedding dress and listened to Douglas Ashford's voicemails in order. The first was clipped and controlled. "Naomi, this is Douglas. Call me immediately. There's been a serious mistake." The second had lost some of that composure. "Colton had no authority to terminate you. None. Please call me back." By the 6th message, the founder who had once seemed unshakable sounded almost frantic. "The Miller's Landing submission is due Monday morning, and no one can get into your system. The password Colton set doesn't work. The Westside development team is threatening to pull out entirely. Naomi, please." Silas found her there a few minutes later, careful not to crease her dress as he sat beside her. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind, before he finally spoke. "There's something I should have told you before today," he said. "For the last 6 weeks, I've been reviewing Ironbridge's structural filings for Miller's Landing. Specifically, the ones Colton signed off on personally after the engineering team had already approved the original specs." Naomi felt something drop through her chest. "What did you find?" "Load-bearing wall thicknesses reduced after final sign-off. Cheaper substrate material swapped in on 2 of the 4 support columns. A fire suppression spec quietly downgraded to meet a tighter budget line." Silas's voice stayed level, but his jaw tightened. "None of it would pass a real inspection. I've been documenting it for weeks. I was going to file a formal report with my supervisor next week." The room went very still. Naomi understood, in that moment, exactly why Silas had looked so unbothered by the firing text hours earlier. It wasn't indifference, it was foresight. Getting fired on her wedding day hadn't just been cruel. It had, without Colton realizing it, severed Naomi's legal proximity to a fraud that was about to become public, while leaving the company completely dependent on a system only she understood how to operate. "How long have you known?" she asked, still holding the phone loosely in her lap. 6 weeks, Silas admitted. "I almost told you twice. Once at dinner, the week we picked the venue, and once the morning of the rehearsal. I didn't want it to be the thing that colored our wedding before it even happened. I told myself I'd file the report the following Monday and let the process run its course without pulling you into it. I didn't expect Colton to hand you the exact leverage you'd need and hand it to you on the one day I couldn't imagine bringing it up myself." Naomi turned the small compact mirror over in her hands, watching her own reflection catch the light. "You were protecting me," she said slowly, "from a decision that ended up protecting you both." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the first real one since she'd read the text in the vestibule. She thought back, in that quiet moment, to the countless late nights she'd spent building the tracking system Colton had never bothered to learn. The color-coded flags for pending permits, the automated cross-checks between engineering sign-offs and final material orders, the fail-safes she'd built in specifically to catch the kind of last-minute substitution that had apparently been happening under everyone's nose for weeks. She'd built it to protect the company. She hadn't realized, until this exact moment sitting in her wedding dress, that she'd also built the only tool sharp enough to expose it. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Silas took her hand, careful of the flowers still woven through her fingers. "Tonight, we dance. Tomorrow, we fly to the coast for our honeymoon like nothing happened. And when we come back," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "we take the whole thing apart, piece by piece, on our own terms." Naomi searched his face for any trace of doubt and found none. It occurred to her, sitting there in her wedding dress with her whole career suddenly in question, that she had married a man who thought in the same careful, systematic way she did. A man who didn't panic, who built a case brick by brick before ever raising his voice about it. Whatever came next, she understood she wasn't facing it alone, and that realization steadied her more than any voicemail from Douglas ever could. They returned to the reception. Naomi danced with her father, laughed at her uncle's terrible toast, and smiled for photographs like a woman without a single worry in the world. All while her phone quietly climbed past 200 missed calls in her purse. A number that would, within days, feel almost small compared to what was coming. Nadia caught her eye once more near the end of the night, mouthing a silent question across the dance floor. "Are you okay?" Naomi answered with a small, steady nod, and for the first time all evening, she meant it completely. Whatever Colton had intended by that forward text, he had badly misjudged both the woman he was firing and the man she had just married. The calls didn't stop during the honeymoon. If anything, they escalated. On the second day, while Naomi and Silas walked a quiet stretch of shoreline in South Carolina, Douglas Ashford left a message offering to double her salary if she'd return by the end of the week. Naomi listened to it once, deleted it, and kept walking. 2 days later came an offer of partial equity in the firm, an offer that, 6 months earlier, would have thrilled her. Now it barely registered. A third message arrived the following morning, this one from Colton directly, his voice tight and clipped in a way that suggested his father had made him place the call. "Naomi, I think there's been a miscommunication about your employment status," he said, as though the forward text had been some kind of clerical accident rather than a deliberate act. "If you could give me a call back, I'm sure we can sort out whatever paperwork issue caused the confusion." Naomi listened to it twice, mostly out of disbelief that he still hadn't managed the word "sorry," and deleted it without responding. Silas noticed her declining these extraordinary offers without a second thought, and understood something essential about his new wife that Colton Ashford never had. This had never been about a paycheck. It was about the 8 years she'd spent building something that mattered, only to be discarded by a man who couldn't be bothered to learn how it worked. On their last evening on the coast, watching the tide pull back from the sand, Silas turned to her with an idea he'd clearly been sitting on for days. "The city's planning department has an opening for outside compliance consultants," he said. People who understand submissions from both the design side and the inspection side. People who could build verification protocols strong enough to catch exactly the kind of corner-cutting Colton's been doing. By the time their flight landed back in Dayton, Naomi had a rough business plan sketched across the back of an in-flight napkin. 3 days later, she filed the paperwork for Bedrock Verification Partners. Her phone rang within the hour of the registration going public. It was Douglas. "Naomi, thank God," he said, his voice hoarse with something close to panic. "Miller's Landing has stalled completely. 2 client teams are threatening to walk. Whatever you're charging now, we'll pay it. Please, just come back." In the days after filing Bedrock's paperwork, Naomi called Selena Ruiz, the only person from Ironbridge she still trusted completely, and offered her a position running client intake. Selena accepted before Naomi finished the sentence. "I've been documenting things too," Selena admitted quietly on that call. "Not as formally as Silas, but enough. I always figured someone would need it eventually." Within a month, Bedrock had 3 employees, a modest office 2 blocks from the county courthouse, and a growing list of municipal contacts who had heard, through industry channels, that someone finally understood both sides of a permit file well enough to make submissions genuinely safer rather than just faster. "I appreciate the offer, Douglas," Naomi said, her voice steadier than she expected. "But I'm not available for employment. I've started my own firm. My first client is the city of Dayton. I'll be developing new verification protocols for building submissions across the county, including, I imagine, a fairly thorough audit of everything currently sitting on Miller's Landing." The silence on the other end of the line told her Douglas understood exactly what that meant. If Bedrock was auditing city submissions, Colton's altered filings would surface with or without her involvement. "Naomi, please," Douglas said, his voice breaking slightly. "Colton made a terrible mistake. He was always going to be measured against you, and it made him reckless. Let me fix this." "Some things don't get fixed, Douglas," Naomi said. "Some bridges, once they're burned, stay burned." She ended the call and turned to Silas, who had been listening quietly from across the kitchen. "Is it wrong that felt good?" she asked. "It's not wrong to protect yourself," Silas said, "or the people who'll actually live in that building someday." The following weeks moved quickly. Naomi's insider knowledge of exactly how firms like Ironbridge operated made her uniquely dangerous as a consultant, and the city's compliance audit, run with her new protocols layered directly on top of Silas's original documentation, turned up violations across nearly every submission Colton had personally handled. Thinned load-bearing walls, substituted foundation materials, a fire suppression system quietly downgraded below code. Each finding was logged, cross-referenced against the original engineering approvals, and presented to the city planning board in a report that carried both Naomi's name and Silas's, side by side, on the same page, for the first time since they'd met across a permits counter. The board's response was immediate. The Miller's Landing project was suspended indefinitely and reassigned to a competing firm, Hartwell Design Collective. Colton wasn't simply removed from the project. He was blacklisted across the regional industry, and his professional license was suspended pending a formal ethics review. Ironbridge lost the largest contract in its 30-year history and lost it publicly, with local business journals running headlines that used words like catastrophic and self-inflicted within the same week. Through mutual contacts, Naomi heard that Douglas had been hospitalized briefly for chest pains not long after the news broke. Selena Ruiz, Naomi's former assistant, called her directly the day it happened, her voice shaking. "He kept saying your name in the meeting before it happened," Selena told her. Not angry, just quiet, like he finally understood what he'd let happen on his watch. Despite everything, the news brought Naomi no satisfaction. Douglas had been, for most of her career, a genuinely good mentor, before a blind spot for his own son had cost him almost everything he'd built. She sat with that discomfort for several days, unsure whether it counted as compassion or simply exhaustion. Industry reaction to Colton's blacklisting was swift, and in some circles, almost gleeful. Two former colleagues Naomi hadn't spoken to in years reached out separately, both admitting they'd suspected something had been off about Colton's submissions for months, but had been too junior or too afraid to say anything. A regional trade publication ran a feature on the collapse of Miller's Landing that quoted an anonymous city engineer describing the discovered violations as some of the most brazen corner-cutting the department had documented in over a decade. Naomi read the piece once, closed the tab, and didn't read it again. She had no interest in becoming the story's villain slayer. She only wanted the building done right. Silas, for his part, found himself quietly commended within his own department for the thoroughness of his original filings, though he brushed off the praise whenever it came up. "I didn't do it to be recognized," he told Naomi one evening over dinner. "I did it because somebody was going to live in that building eventually, and they deserved better than a shortcut nobody bothered to tell them about." It was, Naomi thought, exactly the kind of quiet conviction that had made her trust him in the first place, long before either of them understood how much that trust would end up costing, and ultimately rewarding them both. Some evenings, she caught herself replaying the moment in the vestibule, phone trembling in her hand, and marveling at how completely the balance of power in that memory had reversed itself in under half a year. 6 months into Bedrock's growth, with contracts now covering 3 separate municipal departments, a cream-colored envelope arrived at Naomi's new office, addressed in Douglas Ashford's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a letter, longer than she expected, asking not for her return to Ironbridge, but for a single meeting, not to rehire her, the letter specified, but to review a completely rebuilt company structure Douglas had spent the last half-year constructing from the ground up. Naomi almost declined outright. Instead, curiosity won, and she agreed to a meeting the following week, though she nearly walked out entirely when she arrived to find not just Douglas waiting in the conference room, but Colton as well, seated stiffly beside his father, with his eyes fixed on the table. "Thank you for coming," Douglas said, rising to greet her. He looked older than the year that had passed, new lines carved deep around his eyes, his broad shoulders noticeably more stooped. "Tate has something he needs to say to you," he corrected himself immediately. "Colton. Colton has something he needs to say. Colton finally lifted his eyes. Whatever arrogance Naomi remembered from their final months working together had been replaced by something closer to genuine shame. "What I did was unprofessional," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Choosing that day specifically to hurt you, there's no version of an apology that undoes it. But I am sorry, and I understand now exactly how much damage it caused to the company and to people who deserved a building that wouldn't fail them." Naomi studied him for a long moment before responding. "Apology noted," she said, careful to neither accept nor dismiss it outright. "But an apology doesn't rebuild a load-bearing wall, Colton. It doesn't explain to a family why their new apartment building failed an inspection 18 months after they moved in. Words are the easy part. I'm more interested in what you're prepared to actually do differently." Colton's jaw tightened, but he nodded, absorbing the correction without arguing it. It was, Naomi noted silently, the first time she'd ever seen him accept criticism without immediately redirecting blame somewhere else in the room. Naomi glanced briefly at Douglas before answering, noting how carefully he'd chosen to let his son speak first rather than smoothing things over on his behalf, the way he might have a year earlier. It was a small detail, but it told her something had genuinely shifted in how this company operated, even before she'd read a single page of whatever they'd brought her. Douglas slid a thick folder across the table. Inside was a complete overview of Iron Bridge's rebuilt internal review process, new safety protocols, an entirely restructured chain of sign-offs, and a formal consulting proposal offering Naomi a significant fee simply to evaluate whether the changes were genuine. "We're not asking you back," Douglas clarified quickly. "Just to tell us honestly whether we've actually changed, or whether we're only telling ourselves that." Before Naomi could answer, Colton stood abruptly and left the room, returning a moment later with a small envelope, which he set down with visibly unsteady hands. Inside was a certified check for the exact cost of Naomi's wedding, down to the final flower arrangement. "How did you even calculate this figure?" Naomi asked, more unsettled than touched. "Your wedding planner and my father's assistant know each other," Douglas admitted quietly. "I asked for the precise total. I wanted it to mean something specific, not just a gesture. Consider it the gift I claim to be giving you," Colton said, "when I had no right to take anything from you at all." He placed a small drive on the table beside the check. "This is the original tracking system. Every password, every access point, exactly as you built it. We rebuilt a version of our own after you left, but it's never worked the way yours did. It's yours. Keep it, or delete it. Either way, it belongs to you." Naomi stared at the small drive, feeling the strange weight of 2 years of work distilled down into something she could hold between two fingers. The same system that had once been weaponized against her by a man who refused to let anyone else learn how it worked. She thought, briefly, of the training sessions Colton had canceled as unnecessary expenses, of the afternoons she'd spent building documentation nobody at the company would ever be permitted to read. It was strange, holding proof of that effort now, in a room where the man who dismissed it sat across from her, visibly smaller than she remembered him. "Why give this back at all?" she asked, turning the drive over once in her palm. "You could have kept pretending your rebuilt version was close enough. Because pretending is exactly what got us here," Colton said quietly. "I spent 3 years pretending I understood a business my father handed me, instead of learning it. I'm done pretending anything is close enough." Douglas watched the exchange between them without interrupting, his hands folded tightly on the table. When Naomi finally looked over at him, he offered a small, tired nod, as though confirming something he'd hoped for, but hadn't been certain he'd actually see. It struck her that this, too, was a kind of restitution. A father finally stepping back far enough to let his son answer for himself. Naomi closed the folder and stood, her decision arriving with more clarity than she expected. "I'll review your proposal," she said, "but not as a returning employee. My fee is triple your original offer, paid in advance, and my firm requires full access and full transparency across every submission you file from this point forward." Douglas agreed instantly. "And one more condition," she added, turning to Colton directly. "You personally complete every training module my team assigns, every basic protocol, every regulatory requirement, until you understand this business from the foundation up, not from a title your father handed you." Color drained from Colton's face, but he nodded without hesitation. That evening, a news alert on Naomi's phone revealed the reason behind Douglas's timing. Hartwell Design Collective, the firm that had taken over Miller's Landing, was now under state investigation for allegedly bribing city officials to fast-track approvals despite serious design flaws of their own. Silas suspected immediately that Douglas had known this was coming and was positioning Ironbridge to reclaim the project the moment Hartwell collapsed. For a moment, Naomi felt used all over again, until she realized the opportunity in front of her wasn't Douglas's to control anymore. It was hers. "What are you going to do?" Silas asked that night, watching the storm gather behind her eyes as she set the phone down on the counter. "I'm going to sleep on it," she said. "This deserves careful thought, not an angry decision made at 10 at night." But sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake replaying the meeting, turning over whether Colton's contrition was genuine or simply another performance, whether Douglas was chasing real reform or just trying to save a company before a competitor's collapse handed it back to him anyway. By morning, she had her answer, and it wasn't the one either Ashford was expecting. The next morning, she called Douglas back with a counteroffer of her own. Not a consulting contract, but a formal partnership. Bedrock Verification Partners would oversee all compliance and regulatory sign-off on every Ironbridge project going forward. Operating as an entirely independent entity, presented publicly as a partner firm. Any project Colton touched would pass through triple verification with no exceptions. After a full day of board deliberation, Douglas agreed, adding only a 3-year minimum commitment, which Naomi accepted without hesitation. When Hartwell was formally removed from Miller's Landing 2 weeks later, the newly formed Ironbridge Bedrock Partnership was ready, with an updated submission, enhanced safety documentation, and a verification system built from the best parts of Naomi's original design, layered with new city-mandated safeguards. The city awarded the project back to Ironbridge, and local press covered the partnership as a new model for architectural accountability in the region. Colton was reassigned as a junior project coordinator, 5 levels below the directorship he'd once held, completing daily training modules that Naomi's team assigned and reviewed personally. 3 months later, Naomi found him at a construction site before sunrise, checking concrete specifications against approved plans without being asked. "Why did you do it?" she asked him directly. "Why that day, specifically?" Colton was quiet for a long moment. "Because you were right about everything, and I couldn't stand it," he admitted. "The training sessions I canceled, the safety concerns I dismissed. I thought firing you would make me feel powerful. Instead, I watched the whole department collapse without you, and I watched my father's face when he realized what I'd done. He looked up. I destroyed the best mentorship I ever could have had in about 4 seconds over a text message." "You can't undo that," Naomi said. "But you can become someone who never repeats it. Forgiveness isn't owed for an apology. It's earned through consistent, unglamorous proof over time." Colton nodded, and for the first time since she'd known him, she believed he understood exactly what that would require. 6 weeks later, Selena arrived at Naomi's office unannounced, delivering a message on Douglas's behalf rather than through a formal call. Douglas wanted to promote Colton to assistant project coordinator and wanted Naomi's honest assessment before he made it official. "He's completed every training module with perfect scores," Selena said. "The crews on site actually respect him now. I didn't believe that would happen either, for what it's worth." Naomi considered it carefully before answering. "Tell Douglas I'll support it, on one condition. Colton handles the next community presentation on Miller's Landing alone. No script from the communications team. No one standing behind him to catch him if residents come in hostile. Let's see who he is when there's no title left to hide behind." Selena hesitated at the door on her way out. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think he's performing anymore. I think he's actually scared of disappointing you again, which is a very different thing than being scared of you." Naomi thought about that assessment long after Selena had gone, turning it over the way she once turned over a blueprint, looking for the flaw nobody else had caught yet. In the end, she found she believed it, and allowed herself, cautiously, to hope it would still be true a year from now. 6 months later, Colton stood in front of a packed community meeting in the same neighborhood Miller's Landing was meant to revitalize, and, without prompting from anyone, opened his remarks with an admission most executives would never make publicly. "My name is Colton Ashford," he told the room. "Last year, decisions I made personally put this project and this community at serious risk. I'm here to walk you through exactly how that will never happen again." Naomi watched from the back row, unrecognized, as skepticism in the room slowly softened into something closer to cautious trust. When an older resident stood up and asked, pointedly, why anyone should believe the same company that had already failed them once, Colton didn't reach for a rehearsed line. "You shouldn't have to believe us," he said. "You should be able to verify it yourselves. Every inspection report from this point forward will be posted publicly before construction proceeds to the next phase. If we're wrong again, you'll know before we do. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. And Naomi noted, quietly, that it was the first time she'd ever heard Colton offer accountability instead of an excuse. Naomi never got the scorched earth revenge some people might have wanted for her. She got something more durable instead. A company forced to rebuild itself from the studs out. A husband who'd quietly protected the public before he ever knew what it would cost him personally. And a business of her own that no single person's cruelty could ever again threaten to take away. As she and Silas walked home past the half-finished riverfront cranes that evening, he asked her the question she'd been turning over for months. "Are you happy with how it turned out?" "I'm satisfied," she said. "Not because anyone suffered, because something actually changed." She squeezed his hand. Sometimes the most complete kind of justice isn't watching someone fall. It's building something strong enough that they finally have to rise to meet it. So here's what we want to know. If a text message like that landed on your phone on the best day of your life, would you have handled it the way Naomi did, patient and strategic? Or would you have let the anger out right there in the vestibule? Tell us in the comments. And while you're there, let us know which part of this story stayed with you the longest. If this kind of quiet but devastating justice is the kind of story you come here for, there's another one waiting for you next week, about a family that thought a decades-old debt had finally been forgiven, until the person collecting it turned out to be someone they buried years ago. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because you will not want to find out how that one ends secondhand.